Well, all right. So we can go ahead and get started here. Thank you all for being here for today's Passive House Lunch and Learn on the PHI Path to Certification. I'm Aaron Gunderson. I recognize a lot of you, so I assume you recognize me, but I'm with the Executive Director of Passive House Massachusetts, and we're putting on today's Lunch and Learn in partnership with the Mass Save Passive House and All Electric Homes training program. So I just want to take a couple minutes just to highlight the offerings that they have available, and then we'll shift things over to our featured speaker for today, Ken Levinson, who you can see on your screen, the Executive Director of the Passive House Network. But first, I do want to give a big thanks to Mass Save for all the work they've been doing on putting together presentations like this and others the last 4 years or so. The sponsors of Mass Save listed on the bottom of your screen, you can see there, so thank you to them. Everyone on this is probably familiar with these programs by now, but if you're not, I want to make sure you are, because we need more and more people in the state taking advantage of these. They're available. We want you to use them. What you're seeing on your screen right now is the new all-electric home incentive. This was released last year, and it covered buildings that are 1 to 4 units in size. So single-family residences, townhomes, duplexes, that sort of thing, up to 4 units. And you can see the incentives that are available. There are 2 levels, level 1 and level 2, and that's just based on your energy performance and some of the all-electric steps that you take in terms of what level you achieve. Level 1, if you're looking at that, is pretty much hand in hand with the new stretch code that just went into effect. So the stretch code that will be requiring all-electric homes to achieve a HERS 45 score, that's pretty much hand in hand with the level 1 incentives. So meeting that new stretch code limit, you can also achieve these level 1 incentives and receive those bonuses you see. If you go above and beyond that and get even better energy performance, you can achieve those level 2 incentives and get it even better dollars back for you. So I encourage everyone to take advantage of this. Reach out to me or Mass Save if you have questions about how this works or how you qualify. The incentives that have been available now for the last 4 years are these ones for buildings that are 5 units or more. So multifamily buildings get these incentives. I'm sure you're all familiar with these. I see a bunch of folks on here. I see some names of people already taking advantage of these, so I think you guys know. But for those who haven't used these yet, I do like to remind you that you can enroll in this program and take advantage of the first couple incentives, the feasibility study and the energy modeling, right away. And even if you don't go through with the full Passive House program, you still get those incentives. So if you go through the feasibility study and realize that this is not the right project for you, but your next one will be your Passive House project and not this one, the feasibility study is still covered. So I encourage everyone who's even thinking about Passive House for the next project, which if you're on this session, I assume is all of you, you should enroll in this program, take advantage of the feasibility study from the very beginning. So thanks for listening to this Mass Save portion. I'm going to unshare my screen so that our featured presenter can jump in here now. If you have any questions about these incentives, leave notes in the chat room. I can address them for you, or you can reach out to this email that you see on your screen right now. All right. So Ken, you can go ahead and bring things up. So Great. We're now going to transition to our featured speaker for today. I'm going to welcome Ken Levinson, the Executive Director of Passive House Network. Those of you who have been to other sessions we've done, whether there are lunch and learns or monthly meetings, have seen Ken before. He's a frequent guest of ours, both in person way back in the day when we did more infrequent meetings, and here online. The Passive House Network for many years has been helping to, Ken can do an introduction, but they've been sort of the hub of the Passive House Institute here in the US and in North America. So we're really, really thrilled to have them as a resource for us. And for all of you who are considering projects that will go through the Passive House Institute certification pathway, Ken and the Passive House Network are really your go-to resource. So today, Ken is going to talk about their path to certification for multifamily buildings. Again, for all of you attending, please use the chat room to ask any questions you like or to discuss the content today. At the end of the main presentation, you can also use the raise hand feature to ask questions directly. But for now, stick to the chat, and I'm going to turn things over to Ken. Go ahead, Ken.
Great. Thank you, Aaron. It's great to be here. It's great to be speaking with everyone in Massachusetts and probably beyond, I would imagine. Just a couple of more items about the Passive House Network. We are a national nonprofit. We have regional chapters around the country and national membership, and we really appreciate working with aligned allied groups like Passive House Massachusetts, Passive House Maine. I had the pleasure of being in their forum just a couple of weeks ago in Freeport, New York Passive House, and many others across the country, as well as non-Passive House specific organizations. Of course, we are affiliated with the Passive House Institute and part of a worldwide sort of global effort, and get really as much out of what we learn from those in New Zealand or the UK, Canada, and literally around the world. We are focused on education and community building. It's really through the peer-to-peer knowledge sharing where we find the sort of secret sauce of Passive House. It's a very giving community and wanting to see everyone succeed. A couple of quick notes here then. Our Certified Passive House Designer course is our sort of core competency for delivering Passive House buildings for architects, engineers, and other consultants, and other players for that matter in the building industry. We do have trainings coming up, regional hybrid, so they're online, on demand, live online with some in-person, focused on California, New England, the South, and the Midwest. As well, we work with EMU Building Systems for the CPHT training, the tradesperson training that's aligned with international standards. And we have upcoming in-person in Minnesota or Montana, if anybody's planning on going out west or happen to be in that area. They also have online offerings for the certified course. I do want to invite everyone to come to Wiesbaden, Germany, which the international conference is happening next month in March. And if you haven't been to international conference, it is a trip. It's wonderful to meet people from around the world, see the projects. It's unsurpassed sort of networking and knowledge sharing, getting to see the buildings there, kick the tires, and really be inspired. It's something that you would not regret. And I want to do a shout out for our conference, which will be happening in Denver, Colorado in the fall. In October, we had a great pleasure of being in Boston last June, and looking forward to going to Denver. A lot is happening out there, and we're excited to share that with the world. So the subject today is really on the PHI certification pathway. We're specifically speaking towards multifamily. Obviously, this is going to be generally applicable across the board, but we'll try to make it more relevant there. If you have specific questions, please put them in the chat and we'll get to them at the end. So just starting out, big picture. I imagine a bunch of you have varying degrees of familiarity with the International Passive House Standards and PHI. And so we want to kind of build it up here one step at a time as we go. So as noted at the beginning of the certification criteria, there are basically 3 objectives in the PHI certification: year-round comfortable and healthy indoor conditions, an extremely high level of energy efficiency, and a high level of user satisfaction. And energy efficiency, as we all appreciate, is really the driving lever of that. So as we look toward the Passive House certification process with PHI, we can note that there are no other certifications required. There are no other programs involved in it. It's focused on the PHI certification alone. That said, it certainly supports other certifications. If you have other programs that go, we see many, many different examples of people working with a variety of sustainability goals and using Passive House. We see Passive House as the platform in many ways. You know, it's a high bar to get to, but once you've gotten there, it becomes the floor, right? And that floor really sets you up strongly for success in a broad array of areas. reasons to certify in general, and in this way in particular. So independent review, of course, we need this not just for general best practices, but there may be incentives, or as we know in Massachusetts, regulatory requirements. And so that's very compelling. As compelling, perhaps, is just this idea of expertise and institutional knowledge that the process of certification brings to a project. And it helps you avoid false starts and errors through the process. There's nothing worse than getting down the road and realizing you've hit a dead end and you've got to back up. You want to start out strong and continue down the path. And as such, focusing as we are on education and capacity building, we see the certification process as fundamental education tool and the professional development for the team across the board. And interestingly, you can earn, if you're working on a passive house project and you're not a CPHD, you're not a certified designer or consultant yet, you can actually earn the credential by completing the building. You don't have to take the course. You don't have to take the exam, although it might pain me slightly to say that. You can get the credential by doing a building. And that's really PHI's fundamental thing, is do the building and learn by doing, as we do with so much of our professional lives. So that's another interesting way to go. Of course, taking the course and getting that base knowledge is highly recommended. Assurance for the project team. So as you're moving through all the different players in the project team, we're not taking anybody's word for it. We're cross-checking and everybody's on the same page. And then ultimately, and it may seem counterintuitive, but cost control. It defines your parameters. It puts a rigor to the process. And what we see in terms of passive house projects and costs, an important driver there is experience. It's not everything, but experience can, as one imagines, be critical in being able to optimize not just the energy balance, but optimize the economic feasibility as well. And the certification helps bring that and kind of organize that process. So with that, there are basically 3 steps to the certification. It's the preliminary design stage assessment, preliminary review, the design stage review before the construction starts. And this is where we might get the design assurance letter that we'll speak about a bit more. And then the final review after the construction completion. Of course, there's a bit before and after, right? You're going to hire a certifier and you are going to do an initial check, which we'll speak about. And at the end, once you've done it, you'll get the certificate, occupy, and go forward. So before we dive into these bits and pieces, I just want to touch base briefly on the criteria, because you may or may not be familiar with it. So the Passive House Standards criteria is in this criteria book. It's downloadable. There is the QR code in that lower right, brings you to our certification page on our website, which has links to this criteria and a bunch of other resources you'll see in this presentation. I encourage you to scan it. So the criteria will speak to the kind of full passive house certification, the EnerPhit retrofit certifications, and the low energy building certification. So these are, and these, the first 2 have other certifications built in, we'll talk about, but that's it. The criteria basically is that 16 pages from 9 to 25, along with further technical regulations in kind of delivering that. So one of the fundamental things is trying to keep it as simple and focused as possible, but it is construction, and it does get necessarily complicated in some ways. So to dive into the classic passive house plus and premium. So this is the full certified passive house. We have the basic criteria of the annual heating energy demand at 4.75 kilobtus per square foot per year. You have an alternative criteria of the heating load, the peak load of 3.17 BTUs. And then we have a cooling limit of 4.75 again, with a variable allowance for dehumidification. Because while the cooling is relatively easy to hit, just about anywhere, the dehumidification can be a driver, and there is special allowances made there. The air tightness is 0.6 ACH50 on the volume. And then on the primary energy, they've actually recalculated it, and it's not a straight EUI sort of calculation, source energy calculation anymore. And we don't have time to dive into it today, but I encourage you to look online resources for the primary energy renewable metrics. And what they're trying to do is encourage electrification. Electrification is not mandated by the criteria, but it's certainly encouraged. We're going to an all-electric future, an all-renewable future. And this is a measure relative to how optimized your building is to that future. The plus and premium standards then introduce renewable energy. It could be on the building, on site, and different levels of renewable energy production, while also making the overall energy use tighter, which you can see those numbers going down from the classic to the plus to the premium with the increase in renewable energy. The interesting thing with the renewable energy from PHI is that they're not doing it on a square foot basis, and they're not going for a net zero calculation. Because that is encouraging low flung buildings, right? It's a poor, it could be a poor use of the land, depending on the location and the use profile. So here it is based on the footprint, essentially the shadow or the extended footprint of the building is what you're measured against. So what your renewable production is valued based on how much earth you're taking up in the lot, not how much square foot you're taking up. So whether your building's 1 story or 20 stories, you could conceivably be dealing with that same footprint. On the retrofit side, EnerFit has been around now for 12 years, and it has 2 different basic ways of approaching the EnerFit certification. One is a component method, and you see it, the values across the board for the different aspects of the envelope construction, and they are adjusted per climate zone, and these are PHI climate zones. So you are in the cool temperate in Massachusetts, and then there's the performance method, which is basically a tweaking of those calculated performance results. So from 4.75, we're going to 7.92 in Massachusetts. Both of those methodologies are then share in common a loosening of the air tightness from 0.6 to 1 ACH50, and a loosening of the PER demand. I think the renewable, however, stays the same. And another aspect of EnerFit then is you have the classic plus and premium. You also have where the insulation is is largely on the interior of the structure rather than exterior of the structure. You have the I, the plus I, and you have a retrofit plan that could be certified. This isn't really going to tie into our discussion today, but just by way of background. So a big part of it is planning out, making a long-term plan for your building, wherever it may be at. If it isn't a new passive house building, it's going to need to be upgraded at some point. And we want to make sure that you have a plan so at the end of cycles of upgrades, you end up with a passive house performance and not a mediocre building because you're just changing with minimum requirements as you go. As a note, noteworthy EnerPHit certified building is the Pirelli building now, the Hotel Marcel in New Haven, which we all drive by and know and love. Beautiful building to go visit now as a hotel. And then we have the low energy building standard. So you have a slightly relaxed heating, you have the 1.0 air tightness and slightly relaxed PER, I believe. We do see this actually, however, because for single family, it's still you know, an amazing building and performs favorably across the board in relation to other standards out there. That we have incentives. So XL Energy, that is supporting the Marshall Fire rebuild in Colorado, will accept a low energy building certification as a passive house. They'll also accept the other passive house certifications, but the low energy is good enough. So that's a quick overview of the certifications that are available from PHI. So what do we need to do to get certified? Well, there's this great building certification guide, and really I could probably just ask you to download this and we can all go home, but or go on to other work. It's a good guide. It's not going to cover everything we do here for sure today, but I do encourage you to download it and flip through it. It's got great examples and links to examples of things, talks through the process, some of the rationale. I should also note in the criteria documents, you can get quite a bit of the rationale behind what's going on there in the criteria. Definitions, links to the critical things, so that you have sort of an authoritative reference guide there. So the primary tools that we're using for PHI certification is in multifamily. Virtually everything is being done in Design PH, which is a SketchUp, 3D SketchUp model, souped up for passive house. All the values are going into that, and then it's getting imported into the PHPP and manipulated further there. But architecturally, like a majority of the work certainly is being done in the Design PH. And then you're looking at doing thermal bridge calculations as well, of course, either through Therm or Flixo or others. There are an array of additional tools and everything, well, I don't know about everything under the sun, but quite an amazing and expanding list of tools, some developed by PHI directly, others developed by practitioners from around the world, and available on the PHI website, Passipedia, which is a resource. If you're not familiar with it, definitely go online there, Google Passipedia, and there's a lot of reference material there. So with the basic criteria and tools here, reasons for doing it, we can assemble the team. And just a couple of quick notes here. You know, there's a wide range of people involved in construction, especially larger commercial multifamily construction. Really, two driving things that are required is to have a common language and to have a good attitude. It seems simple. A lot of passive house, you know, people say after to presentation on passive house somewhere, they say, well, that's basic building science, isn't it? And some of this is also just basic common sense. And it's true. It's really in the integration and the goals and follow through. So the common language, we cannot stress enough, the training is what helps do that. You have the common reference points and the common language for doing this. Now you can start with introductory, and it depends on what your role is, whether an introductory is enough or a certified accreditation is important. And we'll talk a bit about the construction phase and crews in a moment. Of course, experience is important. We mentioned it in terms of cost control. I would say, and it depends who you ask, but I've heard it enough to say that first and foremost, it's the attitude of the approach and the experience. You'd like to have somebody with experience. Everybody can't have experience. People are going to be learning and doing it for the first time. I would say the key is access to experience. And this is where the open and generous Passive House community comes in, and the fact that it's across the country and it's around the world, that you must avail yourself of the expertise that's out there. Don't live in a silo. Reach out and ask questions. Find the projects or the examples that you think might be appropriate to refer to. The certifier, of course, and the certification process is bringing a ton of experience with you on board and is really underpinning the team. It can't make up for the team if it's not willing or able to do a good job, but you're starting from a strong point. Now, on the issue of certifiers, you may or may not be aware that there is not one certifier for the PHI standards. So Passive House Institute has accredited certifiers, over 110 and counting worldwide at this point. And I did a little survey. So we have this North American Certifiers Circle. There are 14 organizations, and I think now over 30 individuals that are accredited to certify buildings in Passive House, and typically in working in the US or Canada. And so we work with certifiers to share knowledge, to hear what people are working on, to help expand that institutional knowledge and that web of learning, so everybody can benefit, and kind of try to regularize processes as much as makes sense. But as we'll discuss, things can vary. So I've taken from that list, that longer list, a list of 7 organizations that are actively available for certifying multifamily in Massachusetts. Now, this doesn't include the Passive House Institute itself. You can go to the Passive House Institute and certify, but these others also do. I'm sure Stephen Winter Associates and RDH Building Science are very familiar names in Massachusetts. But the others, Peel, Passive House Academy, Hertz and Lang, and Certifiers Cooperative are all capable. And so sometimes, when you're hiring an architect or an engineer or some other service like this, a lawyer or a doctor, it can depend on, how that working relationship is, as well as cost. So there's no cost fixing, there's no cost discussion among the certifiers. You can go individually, and depending on how they work, what the project is, what their experience is, you will get costs. And so on that note, this is a great presentation done by Matt Bowers, Passive House certification tips from a Passive House certifier. So he works with Certifiers Cooperative, and it's really a presentation about how to most economically, work with your certifier. Like, what do you need to do to make sure that your certifier is going to give you the best price possible? And, not surprisingly, things like your experience in doing the type of building that you're asking to be certified will help that. But anyway, it's a fascinating presentation. Definitely that QR code under it goes specifically to it. But as you're going out to the certifiers, providing some basic project information, leveling the playing field, and doing that is important. So you've got a certifier on board, and it may not be clear what all their services are yet. We'll be getting into that. We want to do an initial check. And I should say, theoretically, you can hire a certifier at any point in the project and get your building certified. You could even do your building and then decide after the fact, I want to certify it, hire a certifier and get it certified if it's certifiable, if you have the documentation, if you have the proof, if you have all the things that are needed to do it and it hits the metrics and it is certifiable. That said, doing multifamily and complex buildings, even with experience, it is highly recommended to bring in the certifier on day one and get the ducks in a row and know what's coming. It's only if you're super experienced where you've done them and it's just a matter of course, do you want to come in late? So the initial check is kind of a pre-review. We're not into the actual review process yet. We want to set the baselines, right? What's the certification goal? What's critical to that certification? What are programmatic assumptions that you're making? Special items, and this will always, get that laundry list out there. Elevators, trash chutes, is there parking below? Is there ground floor commercial? What are the variables that we're talking about? What are the special requirements? What are we going to be looking to have default frameworks? And what is there something new? Because if we're going to talk about doing a new typology, like coupled with the multifamily. So for example, we were just talking a couple of days ago about the Crafts senior housing development being designed by Elkis Manfredi, and RDH is on that project in Newton. Obviously the swimming pool, indoor swimming pool, is a special feature. Fortunately, it's not a new typology anymore. There are a lot of defaults there, but it's still requires a certain amount of care, right? Other special conditions. Also, to wrap your head around the process from the certifier, to hear from the certifier you're going to work with, how will the different aspects be assessed in the certification? What kind of information do you have to provide to this certifier? Who's doing the drawings and the details? Who is providing specific specifications? What information and documentation is expected, and the verification process during the construction, which we'll circle back on. So important, and to get a basic grasp of that. Don't assume anything, ask the certifier, and please avoid surprises. Things change in projects, and certainly things can be unavoidable, but do what you can to lay it all on the table. Now, with many of these multifamily buildings now, the commercial base is kind of becoming standard, if not ubiquitous. And this has been an issue historically in terms of, how are we dealing with the values, and how are we resolving it. Now, in the criteria in that criteria book I first showed, there is this table, and this is a little mind-numbing to go through here all very specifically, but basically we've got this gradation of occupancy. So on the top line, I'll just briefly go through these, the big text. The user of the ground floor is known, and we're going to build it to pH quality, passive house quality, that's the air tightness, that's the thermal values, that's the ventilation. So the whole building can be certified, and the plaque can go on the outside of the building on the curb. The second one, the user is not known, but we're still applying passive house air tightness, thermal, air quality, and ventilation. Now we're making some assumptions now on to develop that because we don't know who it is. So there are some default values that have been developed for that. So you can still certify the whole building and have the plaque outside the building. If the user is not known, but you have a passive house enclosure, the air tightness and thermal, but you don't have the ventilation, the air tightness can extend to the entire building. So that can be helpful, right? Because we know the bigger the building, the easier it is to have the air tightness, and you don't have to create air tightness between the ground floor and the upper floors in terms, at least you may do it for other reasons, but for the passive house energy model, which is what the PHI is focused on, you do not need to have a passive house blower door tests separately and have them separated. So you do that as a whole building model. But because there's no ventilation, the plaque goes inside the upper floors and only the upper floors are certified. Now, the next one is the user is not known and not pH quality, but possible in the future. So this is looking to have the whole building come online. The air tightness cannot extend to the entire building. You've got to segregate that for the passive house blower door test for the certification. And then finally here, the user is known but not pH quality, but possible in the future. And this is also the air tightness cannot extend to the entire building. And so you're only, for most of these, you can see or many of these, you're certifying the residential floors above, not the base of the building. Ideally, you're doing the whole building. There are also existing retrofit examples here plugged in. I won't go into these here because that's really a whole other conversation. So that's some of the clarifications that have developed in picking your pathway and what you're going to need to do. And what's happened is, you know, this whole question went through a process, and you need to think about when you're doing your passive house project and the typologies and what you're asking for. Because if you are to be the first of something, often it's not going to be what I would call a normal process. It's going to be a pilot project. It's first generation. PHI is interested in them because that's how we extend the standards further and further and make it work. But they want to go through a scientific process. This is a research organization. Why I've circled that diagram of the Passive House Institute. A big chunk of it is about ongoing research. There are a lot of physicists in this picture, and it's about experimentation and finding, you know, running the dynamic simulations, getting really detailed data, and then testing the boundary conditions and requirements, and developing simplified data. You know, so the PHPP is a simplified model built on lots of dynamic modeling and lots of data. So this has each new typology going through it. Then once they've got a simplified criteria, often you'll see test projects then to use it. And then they'll issue a final criteria for regular usage, and you'll start to build defaults in. Recent pilots include a hospital in Frankfurt, all electric commercial kitchens, which again, the project in Newton that we discussed a couple of days ago has an all electric commercial kitchen. RDH, who's working on that project, has done a number of all electric commercial kitchens at this point with PHI, and they are in the process now of developing those default values. So those that come later don't have to go through the same struggles, but be able to plug in certain things and boundary conditions. Biolabs is also on that pathway. And the image is an art gallery, a new huge art gallery in Vancouver, designed by Herzog de Meuron. It has many dining halls, and all kinds of, massive elevators and things. And so not a normal process, I would say, going on there, but hopefully one that will be able to all benefit from at the end. So by and large, using multifamily ground floor commercial, you're at this point going to be relatively smooth sailing in terms of the criteria and defaults. But you may hit something if you're going outside the box. You want to know that. And again, that's that early check. You want to lay that out there. So then we're going into schematic design. The team is launched, and you're working in schematic design and design development. This is important to do, I would say, before you're going into construction documents. You're going to really dig in, and the certifier is going to assess the concepts for the design and installation, the building services, the preliminary PHPP calculations for consistency, key information, and the certifier is going to provide you feedback, and it's going to help you in managing the energy budget and your costs. This is an image of that project, the Craft Senior Housing. So you want to get this feedback early and know that you're on the flight path. You also want to manage your energy budget like you do the cost. You need contingency in there. You don't want to be designing up to the limits. You want to buffer and build that in so that you have some latitude going forward. A big assist in bringing together the design is to rely on certified components. Now, PHI has an extensive library at this point of certified components, and the key components in terms of driving performance. So, and you see them in the different categories: the opaque building envelope, transparent building envelope, and building services. And they're rated based on climate. And the thing that's great about the components that have gone through the system that are certified and are in the library, many of them are already in the PHPP. You've got the values. And so it's predictable, high quality results, and a smoother process. So if you go outside of certified components, then you're going to have to provide substantially more backup to prove the performance. Some manufacturers may have that ready. They've prepared for it, but others may not, and it could throw a wrench in. So you want to carefully source the critical components that are driving the energy use of the building. And I just want to outline here three that are, we can't overemphasize how important they are. The efficiency of the ventilation units and how they perform, the performance of the windows, and the air tightness are all huge drivers of the overall energy model and optimizing cost and approach. So, there are always trade-offs in this, but to really not trade things out lightly, you really want to make sure you're digging into it, if to state the obvious. As you're going through this preliminary design check, you're starting to gather information, and some things may be decided and you can upload it. So PHI has an online platform for the certifiers. Not all certifiers use this. Some have their own kind of checking mechanism, but this is a very powerful platform that allows you to see, okay, what's been completed and what needs to be completed. It takes some mystery out of it. It shows how far you've progressed, and allows you to really zero in on, what's the missing information, because it could be, there's quite a lot going on there. Another key aspect in the preliminary design review is our variance, and the idea of using defaults, or what the boundary conditions, the so-called real world. So The PHPP and the approach comes with a whole bunch of defaults. Everything is not a default, but there are a lot of default values in there that you can rely on for certification, and make perfect sense to do so. Others, maybe not so much. And so one key aspect here is that many boundary conditions, well, two things. The second bullet is many boundary conditions and values are preset as defaults and should not be changed for certification. So for the certification, the default is fine. But if the variation of actual use is significant, variation in actual use is significant, and known, a second variant showing it must be calculated. So in the PHPP, you can run a whole bunch of variants and show different loads in different ways and different usage patterns. You can show different future climate scenarios. And it's not uncommon to do them for things like hot water or future climate or other specific scenarios. And it doesn't require building a whole new model. You're just putting variants into the same model. But you need to know within reason, how this building is actually going to perform. There's always going to be variation, but from the facts that to calculate it to that. And that may not exactly be the certification calculation. It's going to depend, but you don't want to ignore that. And that checking, as I've bolded here, second variant showing it must be calculated, is part of the certification process. So you're continuing to design multifamily building, and you're bringing the information up further. You're nailing down the supporting documentation, the specifications. You're making corrections per the certifier's requests. So the certifier is going through the models and the documents and, say, oh, this is done wrong. This, this needs to be updated. Where's this information, to make it as complete as possible before construction starts. A quick note on, what the certifiers are thinking about, really, because you're in this ongoing conversation with them, are the assumptions that you're making, that the team's making, are they appropriate to the project? They need to see the thought process of the team. Don't be a blank slate. Don't hold back. They need as much information and to understand what you're trying to do as possible. It will help streamline the process. Is it a complete PHPP? There are lots of little things that go into the energy calculation of a multifamily building. Are there the elevators in there? Are the booster pumps accounted for? Are they accounted for correctly? What's the specifications? Oftentimes the plan may not match the model because, as we know, you're making a design change. It needs to go through structural designers, the mechanical engineer. These are complex buildings. The drawings don't match up all the time, every day at the drop of a hat. The certifiers understand that the drawings are lagging behind in some ways. The PHPP should be up to date to current thinking that they're looking at it, because that's going to be the ultimate check, right? So put some notes in the PHPP if they're not matching up. Clear, if not perfect. We're not expecting perfection. They're not expecting perfection, but they do need to know what you're trying to do. So confirm the narrative in the modeling methodology, the boundary conditions, the spaces being used. Again, no surprises. Is there wiggle room in the energy budget? Does the manufacturer have the data needed if you're not using certified components? A big thing, and it can really hold up projects if this hasn't been thought through. Especially if there are changes out at the last minute. This could be an issue during construction as much as the pre-construction, or maybe even more. So you've gone back and forth, and the certifier is satisfied that the drawings, the specifications, the completeness of the PHPP PHPP are enough that certification is in the future of this project if it's built according to the plans and specifications and the PHPP model. So in the certifiers for PHI can issue a design stage assurance letter. It's not a pre-certification or certification of any kind, just an assurance letter that this will be a passive house. And we see this being used for all kinds of jurisdictions, incentives, code requirements. So then we jump to final review. Of course, there's a little something called construction of the project between the design assurance letter and the final review, or the completion of the final review. So let's take a quick look here at the process overview briefly, where we've come down to the construction line. So, you've done documentation, your certifiers reviewed it, is it complete or not? You're going back and forth and around. You finally get to this issue design stage assurance letter, and you're going into construction. As far as the certifier is concerned, the next step is submit post-construction documentation. Again, you could be done with your project and go to the certifier. They just need to know that you've got all the information that they need. I would say, regarding the process and starting to think about the builders as the team member, obviously there's training involved. In my opinion, you want builders that are capable of building quality multifamily buildings that have that typology down. You don't want them learning more than one thing. And that they can then integrate the passive house requirements. Passive house at the end of the day is not that complicated. It's about intention and rigor and follow through and a bit of documentation. And we've seen builders of all kinds do it successfully. They need to be good builders who can build that type of building well. And then the passive house, you elevate everything and you get it done. So in the construction, just threw down a bunch of things here. The focus is on passive house integration with the other requirements. Where PHI is focused on the elements that are driving the energy performance and ultimately the user satisfaction and use of the building, those three original principles that we spoke to. But there's a lot going on and there's a lot of other things that need to happen. So the construction schedule needs to have a critical path with the PHI requirements identified. You need to be looking at the sequencing and components. Things like mock-ups on a multifamily will be quite typical of critical assemblies that will be responsible for making sure that we have weather tightness, but thermal continuity as well as air tightness. So that should be planned for if needed. A lot of this too depends on, like we were saying at the beginning, how many times has the team done this? Is this new? They've done 10 of them. The more inexperienced, the more you want to go in deep, and the more experienced, the more it could just be like we're doing a blower door at the end, and not doing any blower doors down the road, and that's good enough. So trade specific training. What we're seeing is the management often getting the certified tradesperson or some aspect of it, the project manager, and then doing specific on-site trade training specific to the task at hand. Because again, it's not rocket science and they don't necessarily need to know everything. It's nice for sure. And we encourage everybody to be able to speak the full vocabulary and the full language of passive house. But in terms of critical path, it can be quite targeted. Having people identified that are responsible for the work on the job site in different ways, whether it's the envelope or the mechanical systems. Regular orientation training for new workers. You have workers going off and on these job sites, big ones, multi-year projects. There can be serious turnover. It's not good enough to just train the first team, right? It's obvious enough, but we want to nail that down. So the big part of this regarding PHI and the certification is the photo documentation, that this is really going to be the living record going forward after the project, to know that the insulation is in that wall and it is the right thickness. Now, different certifiers or different teams may have a different comfort level in terms of the documentation and how it's done, but there's certainly a baseline of extensive documentation to make sure that all the different the points are hit. It just maybe if you're dealing with a 24-story building like Cornell Tech, you're going to spot check things and make sure that things are done properly. On the Cornell Tech with the air tightness, that is the one blower door and the one fan to pressurize and depressurize the Cornell Tech tower. And I think they came under or right at about 0.4 ACH 50. So everybody can do it. So for the final review, so you've gone through construction and there's a lot happening there, obviously. But at the end of the day, for the final review for certification, there are 6 things that need to be evaluated. And these have subgroups, of course, but number 1, as-built construction plans, details, and component specifications of the items. So as-built, what wasn't actually installed. So regarding the thermal envelope, the building services and other items agreed to. So everything that's driving the energy performance of the building. As-built PHPP, showing the energy balance calculation, meeting the metrics of the criteria in the certification. The installation photographs that we've spoken of. Then the ventilation system commissioning report, because the ventilation system is like the air tightness report, which is next, is absolutely fundamental to the proper operation of a passive house building. And with those reports, you have the construction manager's declaration attesting to all that has been submitted. That's what they need. No more, no less. Again, going back to the submissions tracking, when you're coming up to the end and you're wondering why you're not certified, make sure that you've got green going across the board. Make sure that here is 100%, and that you're hitting it. So you want to track that carefully. And we issued the certificate. PHI issues the certificate. You get a certificate booklet with the documentation of the energy balance calculation and all the relevant characteristic values of the building. In addition to the booklet, you get an actual certificate, or this is an example here. And then you could get a wall plaque, depending on the certification that you've achieved, to put on the building, as we've discussed before. One thing that I just want to stress is this is outside of the certification process, but a useful reference and something we encourage everyone. PHI has a worldwide building database that it's less than a tiny fraction of the buildings that exist around the world and in the US. It's really unfortunate. It's been an opt-in mechanism. So as one might expect, nobody has a lot of free time to populate such a thing. We try to encourage it, but what is there, it can be quite useful. And so we encourage people to add their project. So when you're starting your project, it doesn't need to be complete. It doesn't need to be certified. You need to have a PHPP. You need to be going for certification levels of performance. and enter it into the database and then update it. Here is an example of Cornell Tech building. And interestingly, in that link is a whole project documentation. And this is another way people on staff can become certified designers or consultants, is by putting together this project documentation, taking responsibility for it and submitting it as part of the process. So there's a wealth of information. This one on Cornell is like, I don't know, 30 something pages with all kinds of details and systems and specifics. And then, you know, the building certification is done. You've registered the building because it's a good thing to do. Then there's occupancy, right? And going forward, these things don't run themselves. It's not part of the certification. The certification is in the rear view mirror. You don't have to do anything going forward, but obviously having the building run as designed and built and predicted requires management. So we want to make sure everybody is focusing on that. So finally, just some thoughts on the PHI process that we think is of use to folks doing their projects, that they have a choice of a certifier, that the scope is focused on the Passive House certification, that you can do other programs. There's by no means is this rigged in a way that is exclusionary. It's open, and we encourage that if that's desired. Judicious use of on-site verification, and it's all very transparent in terms of the project team and what they need to see and what's available. So thank you. I just wanted to put a quick reminder out here about the course coming up. If anyone is interested, in Massachusetts, it's great. You have up to 100% discount on the training is available depending on your situation. Certainly 50% off. Yeah, there are other, this is a national note, so it's not all Massachusetts. And then save the date, and hopefully if you're so inspired, come to Germany, go to Germany, you won't regret it. So thank you. I will stop sharing.
Thank you, Ken. That was a great presentation, very detailed and an excellent walkthrough of the certification process for the Passive House standard, for the PHI standard. We have some questions in the chat room already, so I'll get to those and read off a few. And
Great.
folks, if you want to ask additional questions, now's the time. You can either type them into the chat room or use the raise hand feature in Zoom, and we can let you answer your question directly. But first off, there was just simply a question about, will this be recorded or will slides be shared? So this session is being recorded and it will be posted in our own Passive House Mass Video Library, so you can watch it later. In terms of slides being shared, Ken, will you be sharing any of these slides or make them
I'd be happy
available?
to. Yeah.
Great. If you just want to send a copy to me, even a PDF version, I can make them available as
Yeah.
well on the registration page where you all sign up for this site, or email me if you want them directly. So there was one question here that was liked by someone else, so definitely a popular topic on training is how are building inspectors being trained, or from your perspective from the Passive House Network, I'm sure you've run into this question before, how do you recommend building inspectors get up to speed on the Passive House standard?
I mean, taking the certified Passive House designer course is not overkill. The Passive House Canada has amazingly gotten, in certain jurisdictions like Vancouver, a lot of money to train the building department of the city of Vancouver and to do certified Passive House designer training. It can be dialed back for sure, but it's an easy access, you know, and relatively affordable and very flexible way to do it. And that could be, I mean, what we would love to see is where there are building departments moving in this direction, like the towns of Cambridge and Watertown. And Somerville and Brookline, and growing hopefully, to do an in-house training if that was possible. Everybody's time is stretched and it can be difficult, but to do an in-house training would be invaluable, and it could be customized to do that. I think finding out if there's interest in that and how to do that, that would be great. I know the way the code is written, it's kind of does take, it appears to take the load off of the inspectors. It is through the certification that's driving the compliance. But the certification, the inspectors should know what they're looking at when they're on the job site. And I think to the extent that they are, can speak to it, understand it, and have that shared experience, it's going to help everybody push it forward. We do want to normalize it. It would be great if certification wasn't required and it was just code. And that's where we want to get, right? You want to make yourself kind of obsolete. So.
Yeah, I think that's great. And we at Passive House Mass have been trying to be a resource for the cities and towns here in the state that are trying to get up to speed on Passive House. And that's a recommendation for them as well from us is if you can send some of your building department through these trainings. They're great resources and great ways to get up to speed. And you can have those things reimbursed even at the municipal level, whether it's through the Mass Save reimbursement program or through the other workforce development training resources that are available in the state. So we're hoping that cost isn't a burden for cities.
Right.
Perhaps it's perhaps it's time. There's other factors at play, but cost should not be the thing holding you back from sending folks through those
right
training.
And we should talk going forward. We could help. If you're leading the charge there, which I'm sure you are, to backfill a little bit of information as helpful.
That's great. So any other questions that folks have? We have a good amount of people on here. I hope you guys have some questions, or else you had all your questions answered already. Nothing new in the chat room, and I don't have any hands raised, but this is the time.
I do want to do a shout out. I mentioned the Craft Senior Housing Project several times, and I have an image of it, but I neglected to shout out the Northland Newton project, and which is a total trailblazer and amazing. And the one thing that I meant to say that I didn't say is that which I speak to in various forums, and I think I learned it at the symposium last year at Passive House Mass, was that when Kent Gonzalez there was talking about going beyond the initial commitment to Passive House and doing a bunch more buildings to the low building energy standard, and kind of establishing this level of baseline level of quality, which is, a whole nother level up, which is just tremendous. And I know they are doing a indoor swimming pool and some other things, but the craft one is just too early and too recent in my mind. Sorry about
lots
that,
of great projects. And
shout out.
Going for PHI certification there in Newton. Yeah, the Northland project is incredible. And the craft one, I was lucky enough to attend the presentation you put on that one earlier this week, which was incredible one to see. So lots of examples here in Massachusetts of leading the way and going through this. And as you mentioned, we now have 4 towns who have opted into the new specialized code: Watertown, Brookline, Cambridge, and Somerville. That of course won't go into effect in those towns until later this year, I believe, right, July, but they've opted into it, so it'll go into effect then, and we expect plenty more to opt in here soon and have it go into effect in those towns too later in the year. So folks, any questions? This is my last call for questions here.
Yeah, we look forward. I'll just say we look forward to providing more resources specifically around multifamily. There are things that come up, whether it's the division between the commercial and the residential, elevators, trash chutes, all these things, the electrification in the commercial kitchens and all of that, and to provide some more kind of training wheels to help folks along. But definitely, those 7 certifiers are like a world of knowledge, and it's great because you get different perspectives of the same problem or the same goals, and how to do it. So it's not monolithic at all,
And
but still always hitting that high level to hit the ultimate criteria, certification requirements.
thank you, Ken, so much. And I will say, a lot of the questions that I know folks have, whether it's town officials or developers, folks who are approaching passive house for the first time, a lot of these process questions will be answered by your certifier once you bring them on board. So in a lot of cases, just getting that person on early in the project and going forward, and you'll figure it out together. But thank you all for being here. This was a great lunch and learn. Ken, always great to have you at our sessions. I look forward to seeing you up here in person again in the near future. To everyone else, take care, stay safe, and good luck up there. Bye.
Thank you. Have a great day.
Thank you.